Hi everyone! As you're working on some of your projects at home, I wanted to offer you some resources for colored pencil work. I know that some of you have been attempting to use colored pencils in your different projects, and I wanted to demonstrate to you a little bit today about how I use colored pencils in my work. And this is by no means the only way or the absolute correct way, but just the way that I have found most successful for me. So I encourage you to maybe try out some of these different techniques, but also explore for yourself and see what works for you. I typically use Prismacolor colored pencils, but you can use whatever you have available, whether that's Crayola or a different brand. The Prismacolor seems to blend well together, and they have a lot of different color variations to work with, more so than sometimes you can get from a Crayola pack. The pack that I have here is, I believe, 96 different colors, so that gives me a lot of different options for blending, but you can still create the same type of effect with layering even if you don't have as many color options available to you. So this is something that I have been working on for a few weeks, and I get it out every so often and I work on it for a few hours here and there. So this has taken me probably between 10 and 15 hours so far, I would estimate. And as you move through your own projects with colored pencils, I would encourage you to think about it being a time commitment where it's not something that you scribble down on your page as quickly as you can, but you really have to be thinking about committing your time to making it look realistic and also thinking about it being a layering process. I'm going to do one of the grapes today to demonstrate to you how I layer to get these different color effects. And all of these colors that I have laid out over here are all colors that I have used for this drawing so far. So you will see that there's a vast array of different colors that I've been layering. And even though you might not see specifically, for instance, like this red, it is hidden underneath other layers or it's mixed in with other colors. So as I blend colors together, I'm looking for different variations in my colors. Even though I may see red on my reference picture, it might be mixed a little bit with purple, or it might be mixed a little bit with orange. It just depends on the type of red that I'm looking at. So I'm trying to really see closely the variations in the colors that I've chosen to work with to make sure that I am adding in the correct different values that are going to enhance the colors to make them look even more realistic. So this specific one here, as I'm looking at my reference picture, I am seeing purple and blue and also some shadows. So I'm going to start off with a purple. And as I fill this in, sometimes I do go around the outside edge first and just outline what I'm going to be working within so that I don't go outside of my lines. I am still going to be using the circle shading technique that I know you have become familiar with in art class. This is going to act as my base layer. And I'm not doing this really dark, I'm just making a light base layer because I know that I'm going to be adding many layers on top of this. So this is just a starting point. And some of you, when you're doing projects, are stopping here. And you can tell the difference between what I have down here and what I have up here. This is very flat, doesn't have any highlights or shadows. It doesn't give us any kind of illusion of 3 dimensions. It's just flat. There's nothing really jazzing this up to make it look like it's realistic, like these ones down here. So I know that I have to add a lot to this. I also am going to add into this a blue, very lightly again. This is a second layer on top. I'm starting to see that they are blending a little bit together, but in some areas I do see the white of my paper still within what I'm shading in here. Now I consider this to be a complete base layer. I'm going to use a white colored pencil in this situation now. This is going to help to mix these values together and kind of just solidify that base layer that I have created. It's also going to lighten up what I've done. And I do want it to be lighter. If you can see a lot of these, the base layer that I created, like over here, where there's not shadows, is a lighter version of this. So I do want it to be lighter to match my reference picture. And you will see that this is going to fill in all of those little bumps that look like you can see through to the white of your paper. It's going to make a very clean, smooth looking surface. And I'm still using the circle shading technique. So now I have a nice base layer, and you're seeing now that it matches a little bit more to some of these other ones that I have here. In this corner here, along the left bottom, is where I'm seeing on my reference picture some shadows. This side over here is going to be my lighter side. And you'll see on a lot of these other ones that I've done that the light source is consistent throughout. So we have highlights that are happening along the tops of these ones. So we clearly are having light coming in from above, and the base, the underside of these, is where we're seeing more of the shadows. And that does depend upon some of the other grapes that are nearby. If there's a grape that's overlapping and blocking someone's underneath, those shadows will change. But it is a good idea to be thinking about where is your light coming into this scene, because that does determine where your lights and your darks are going to be incorporated into each individual little piece of your project. So I am going to pick up a darker purple and make the start of my shadow along the left corner. As I'm doing this, I'm starting off darker with heavier pressure along the left edge here, but then I want this to blend into my base layer. So I'm going to really try as I go here to press less and less on my pencil, so that when I get to about halfway here, I'm barely touching my pencil to the paper. I'm still using circles, and it's going to start blending into the base layer that I've created. We don't want any really harsh lines in between our values. We want them to all blend together and appear like one is transitioning right into the other. So you'll see here that I can still see my base layer over in this corner, but now that I've overlapped this darker purple on top, we're seeing less of that along the left side. And in this corner, I have a very, very dark shadow that I need to add, and I'm going to use black to do that. Black is not always the color that you want to use for a shadow, though. You can be thinking about adding a brown on top of something to make it darker, or think about adding a complement. For instance, if I'm using red, I can add green on top to make it darker. So it's good to kind of experiment first and figure out what looks best and what is closest to your reference picture before you commit on your paper. And I oftentimes have paper laying next to me so that I can layer my colors on top of one another and just see what they're going to look like. So I've already practiced and I know what works based on what I've done prior on some of these other grapes. But it is a good idea to just practice ahead of time and see, if I layer this color on top of this color, what happens? If I layer some white on top of that, what's it going to look like? That way, you don't add it to your project and then realize that it's not what you want, and then you're stuck with it. I also, in this situation here, will sometimes write down the names of the colored pencils so that I can replicate the same thing later on. I did some of these grapes a few weeks ago, and when I went back to this, I wasn't quite sure what colored pencils I used. Because I use many, many layers, it's sometimes hard to remember what pencils you've been using. So I look at the name that's written on the pencil, and this one's called Imperial Purple. So sometimes I will write down, okay, I've used Imperial Purple, and then on top of that, I use this blue color, which is called light blue. That way I have a reference point so that when I go back to this, I remember exactly what I did and I'm not spending time trying to replicate on one of my extra papers. I can just go right into this. So what I have here is getting closer to what I see on my screen. I definitely have more highlights to work with on the right side still. So I'm going to go back in with my white colored pencil. And I like to think about my white colored pencil as a blending agent and also as a means of putting a highlight on my work. So I'm using it now to try to create a highlight, and before I was using it to blend. So it has a twofold purpose here. So I'm going over that right upper edge and just trying to move around some of the wax that I've built up underneath so that I can lighten up this area and give the illusion of a highlight there. And I oftentimes, when I'm trying to get the wax buildup off of my paper, I have these little pieces that are coming off from the pencil. I will use my finger and just try to brush them off that way rather than going like this across my paper, because sometimes you will kind of accidentally smear some of those pencil fragments onto your paper, and that's not what you want. So I'm still using circles, and now I've got more of a highlight on the upper right-hand side. I do have a little bit of I'm not quite sure what it is on my reference picture, but it's definitely some kind of smudge looking shape. So I'm going to add that in. And as I was doing each of these, I'm really trying to look at my reference picture and make sure that I'm capturing all the individual little details. That is what's going to make this look unique. If every single one of my grapes was exactly identical to the other, this would not look as realistic, simply because we know that that's not how grapes grow in real life. So I'm really trying to capture each of these individual little intricacies so that I can make this as realistic looking as possible. So I've kind of captured the little shadow smudge thing that I have on the left side of my reference picture, and I also have a tiny, tiny hint of brown along the bottom right-hand corner. So I have a lot of different browns here that I've been using. I'm trying to recall which one I've been using for the grapes. I think it's this one. So I'm going to add a tiny hint of this brown down on the bottom. So far, I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different layers just on one grape. And I would say that this is pretty complete at this point for this one. The last thing that I do, which you can see in some of these other ones, is I add in any really, really dramatic highlights that I'm seeing in my reference picture. And because the grapes are reflective in some situations here, because of their surface, we are getting some very sharp highlights. And so I'm going to use, instead of a colored pencil, I'm going to use a gel pen, and that's going to help me add in those final highlights. And in this situation here, it's along the upper right edge. So sometimes I will just draw and leave it the way that it is. Sometimes I'll draw it on and I'll use my finger to quickly smudge it before it dries so that it blends in a little bit more with the colored pencil. If you do this and you're unhappy with how it looks, you can always color over it with the colored pencil and it will take it off of your paper. So that grape is complete. And I'm going to just keep working on some of this up here so that you can also see a little bit more of some different colors and how I've been blending in with the leaves.